Why did Elimelech move his family to Moab, and what happened to them while they were there? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we begin our verse-by-verse study of the book of Ruth on Walking Through the Bible. Today we're going to be discussing Ruth 1, verses 1 to 5. Before we do that, let's read the passage. If you have a Bible with you, turn to Ruth chapter 1, verse 1. But if you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So Ruth chapter 1, beginning at verse 1. Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land. And a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, the name of his wife was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to the country of Moab and remained there. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left and her 2 sons. Now they took wives of the women of Moab. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And they dwelt there about 10 years. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died. So the women survived her 2 sons and her husband. Coming to the book of Ruth, we come to the first book in the Old Testament which chronologically doesn't follow the previous one. We will see this as we come to other books in the Old Testament, but this is the first time we've seen it thus far. That's because the time period of Ruth is not after the time period of the Judges. It is during the time period of the Judges. The question is, when was this time period? If you watch the introduction to the book, you get a sense of where we believe it was, but since all of the characters haven't been introduced to us yet, we're going to save these conclusions for later. What we do know, though, is that it is sometime in the period of the Judges. Back in our study of Judges, we said that the Judges didn't rule Israel like kings ruled Israel, so it might seem strange to see the word ruled here in verse 1. The Hebrew word, though, means judged or governed, which is exactly what we saw in our study of Judges. These judges were not kings, but they did provide the people with the messages from the Lord, and they did deliver Israel by the will of God from their enemies. But even though we can't yet conclude from the text what period of time during the Judges this took place, we can get our first hint. It was a time of famine. That would mean that it would be some time when Israel was oppressed for her sins. The reason we can conclude this is because after Israel was delivered from her oppressors, Judges says that the land had rest or peace for a period of time. That means that since God was with them, God provided for Israel through the planting and harvesting seasons. However, since the land was in famine, we can conclude that Israel was in idolatry. The famine was so bad that Elimelech, the elder of this family, decided to uproot his family from Bethlehem in Judah and take them to Moab. We need to remember which Bethlehem we're talking about because that will be important for later. It is not the Bethlehem in the north country of Israel, but Bethlehem in the tribe of Judah, the same town where Jesus would be born. Elimelech had a wife named Naomi and 2 sons named Mahlon and Chilion. Now you might ask, why did Elimelech uproot his family from Bethlehem and take them all the way to Moab on the east side of the Jordan River? Why not go someplace else? Well, even though the text does not say, it is reasonable to conclude that the entire land of Israel was under famine due to their disobedience. But the land of Moab must have been thriving. This should also help us pinpoint a time period for this book, for we should be looking for a time period we know this to be so. Now, in moving his family there, Elimelech was exposing them to the culture and idolatry of the Moabites, a culture that could lead them off into sin. But surviving this famine must have been in the forefront of Elimelech's mind, and so exposing his family to idolatry, which was likely already occurring in Israel anyway, was a risk that he was willing to take. Now one might say that it must have been the Lord's will, because how else would they find Ruth, who would become an ancestor of King David and eventually Jesus? But that's a misunderstanding about the providence of God. God does not override our free will in order to accomplish his purpose. Sometimes he speaks to people of that time and tells them to do something, but he doesn't force people to do things they don't want to do. In the end, it doesn't matter what man does, though, for God's will be done no matter what we choose. Did God send the famine in order to get Elimelech to move to Moab so that Ruth could be introduced to the family? Well, that's a possibility. But it also is a possibility that God could have done it another way if he was determined to use Ruth. The fact of the matter is, these are the events that occurred, and so God used them. Overall, Elimelech and his family lived in Moab for about 10 years. This length of stay, being relatively short, rules out the affliction of Samson's day as being the likely time period for the book, as the Philistines afflicted Israel for 40 years, and it seems unlikely that Elimelech would have waited 30 years for his family to move. It, however, doesn't rule out other periods of oppression in Judges. While in Moab, though, Elimelech died, meaning that he never got to see the land of Israel again. Also, while they were in Moab, Mahlon and Chilion took wives from among the Moabites, Orpah and Ruth. Now again, this would not have been something that the Israelites would have done had they been following the law of Moses, but it's not a period of righteousness in Israel, so that this command was broken shouldn't surprise us. Now yes, we know that Ruth would turn out to be a faithful woman towards the true God of heaven, but that's the result of the marriage. It was likely not true in the beginning due to the idolatrous state of the people of Moab. But just like their father, Mahlon and Chilion died in the land of Moab as well, never again seeing their home in Israel. Keep that in the back of your minds. Would there be any time period in Judges where the people living in Moab died in larger numbers? That might help us in dating this book. What these men left behind was 3 widows and no heirs. This fact will play a major role in the rest of this book, so do make a note of that for later. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Ruth chapter 1, verses 6 to 14, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.